until you see it.
From the looks of it now from Sky 13, you'd never know. Last week, Dundee Pond was 30 feet higher than it is now. But no swimming will be allowed.
It is truly dangerous to try to make your way into that riverbed. That's very unstable surface now, very murky.
Dangerous.
And it's also, there's a current, it's a rapids out there.
Eel Weir Canal. Is that what it's called? Eel Weir Canal? Eel Weir Canal? All right. We're getting ready to head up and jump over to the Presumpscot. We're on a little bit of an adventure here this morning. Oh, wow.
We started our trip down the Presumpscot River by first heading north for a short distance in the Eel Weir Canal, which runs parallel to the main river. The canal is an interesting historical waterway, dug by hand by Irish laborers in 1828 for the sake of hauling logs and shipping freight.
Oh yeah. You go in here?
Our first portage was only about 50 yards long, and it brought us to the southern end of Sebago Lake Basin, where we had a short paddle to the other end of the dam. Once to the other side, we had a slightly longer portage back down to the beginning of the Presumpscot River. I've lived in Maine most of my life, but I'm still thankful for days like this when I can get out on the water to explore brand new outdoor places not far from home. This stretch of the river is popular with fly fishermen, but apparently it's not very popular with canoeists. A few of the fishermen we encountered commented about how rare it was to see a boat coming this way.
Oh, first time seeing somebody canoe. No, I'm here quite a bit.
My first time canoeing it.
Yeah, it's first time seeing somebody in a canoe.
Hopefully we didn't mess up your fishing.
Oh, no, you're awesome.
Have a good one.
Good day. How far are you guys going?
I don't know. I was following him. 6 miles, I think, but we got like 3 or 4 portages like that. Yep. Enjoy your day.
We'll want to just see how far we can get.
Yeah, let's do it.
We can call and see.
I mean, there's that tree, but I think we can get around it. John?
I got my tree finder working.
Paddle high five for that one. That was pretty good.
Okay.
That was awesome. That was fun.
That was fun. I didn't think we were going to get stuck there. The water is high.
We got out to enjoy the view of this waterfall and imagined how if we were more skilled, we might try to run it, but decided that the smart thing was to portage around it this time. As the river widened, we had to pay careful attention to picking our lines to make sure we didn't run out of water or run into a dangerous strainer.
Not great, because you can get down the first one, but there's a giant strainer, so you'd have to go back anyways.
Oh, really?
You know what? I like this direction. If I can get there. Like that, you're setting on it, this isn't too hard, and then
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was easy.
it's just that one motion.
John and I had different approaches to the portages. I did it the traditional way, carrying the canoe overhead on my shoulders, and he used a cart. I had an advantage on the rougher trails, but I was thankful John brought an extra cart, which I used when we got to the longest portage at Dundee Dam. This pretty waterfall was near to where the canal rejoined the river, and it also marked the beginning of North Gorham Pond. While paddling through North Gorham Pond, we saw this structure that we assumed was a ski ramp, but we really weren't sure. Let me know if you know what it is. At the southern end of the pond, we took out and portaged about 1/3 mile around the Great Falls Dam and made it back to the flowing river.
So this is normally what, the top part of the Dundee Pond?
Yes.
At this point, you would normally be entering the slack water of Dundee Pond, but we were still picking up good current and began to see clear signs of much lower than normal water levels. We knew there were some areas near Dundee Park that we needed to scout, so we kept our eyes peeled as we navigated these new rapids that are normally in the depths of Dundee Pond. Just below Dundee Park, we stopped and climbed the steep bank to check out the landscape and scout the last big drop. It was fascinating to see the ancient stumps and topography of the exposed lake bed. I'm embarrassed that I grabbed the gunnels instead of bracing here, but like Big D says, sometimes you just need to take the high side. With the rapids behind us, we paddled through the calm and eerie landscape and saw a wreck that is usually deep underwater in Dundee Pond. It may be the last time anyone from my generation gets to see exposed artifacts like this.
They were already refilling the pond, and when John came through a week later, the rapids at Dundee Park were submerged once again.
We also had a chance to see a rare perspective of the exposed Dundee Dam before we made the long portage around to continue on the last leg of our trip. Our takeout was at Shaw Park in Gorham, almost 9 miles and 6 portages from where we started. We worked hard for this distance, but were truly rewarded with an opportunity to run once-in-a-lifetime rapids and see some interesting historical sites. But we had one last interesting sight to see when we floated under Babb's covered bridge and saw the new hole caused when a truck fell straight through the deck into the river below.